Well, it's an absolutely huge day in the history of mixed martial arts and certainly the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Not a moment to waste. Let's get right to it. My name is Luke Thomas. This is my personal YouTube channel. You can like and subscribe. I'd appreciate it if you do. Let's get to it right now. The UFC is done with pay-per-view. Yes, they have a new television deal. Now, of course, this does not take place until 2026. We're still in August of 2025 as I currently record this video. But here's the deal. The UFC and Paramount have announced a new television deal. All UFC events, 43 in total, about 13, well, what used to be pay-per-views, let's call them marquee events, and then 30 fight nights. All of that is going to move to the Paramount family. Now, that's going to be Paramount Plus, with then some of that, I'm assuming the more marquee events, maybe not all of them, but maybe most of them, some of them, I guess we'll see, airing on CBS Linear. Let me read you some of these quotes from the press release. Quote, I couldn't be more excited to join forces with Dana, Ari, and Mark. Rarely do opportunities arise to partner on an exclusive basis with a global sports powerhouse like UFC, an organization with extraordinary global recognition, scale, and cultural impact, said David Ellison, chairman and CEO of Paramount. Quote, Paramount's advantage lies in the expansive reach of our linear and streaming platforms. Live sports continue to be a cornerstone of our broader strategy, driving engagement, subscriber growth, and long-term loyalty, and the addition of UFC's year-round must-watch events to our platforms is a major win. We look forward to delivering this premium content to millions of fans in the U.S. and potentially beyond. Now, there's more to this, by the way. At the bottom of the press release, it says, quote, the 7-year term, which begins in 2026, has an average annual value, AAV, of $1.1 billion. The contract's payment schedule is weighted more towards the back end of that deal. We don't know exactly what that means yet. There's still a lot that's unknown. Now, there's so many different components to this. Let's go piece by piece on this. The biggest piece to me is not that the UFC is with Paramount, although it's kind of funny, right? They started with Spike TV, which was Viacom, and Viacom eventually changed to Paramount. They left Viacom, they go to Fox Sports, then ESPN. Now they're back at CBS, so they're kind of a bit of a full circle moment here with the Paramount/Viacom brand. But the point is, it's the end of pay-per-view. Pay-per-view has been foundational to the UFC's identity since literally its very first event in 1993. 1993 to 2025. That's how long pay-per-view lasted. And pay-per-view was, at first, the only way in which you could watch UFC events. They only expanded the Fight Night franchise under the Spike TV deal, right? Fight Nights didn't exist until then. I mean, just sort of consider that for a moment. And now it's all coming to an end. Now, there have been reports year over year that pay-per-view buys have declined to such a degree that on some level this is not surprising. And I do kind of wonder, what will there be? They're saying they're going to have 13 premium or marquee events. What kind of quality control standards are going in to make sure that they still feel premium? If you're just on CBS or you're just on Paramount Plus and you don't have to sell this behind a paywall, what incentive structure is in place to make sure that the cards are as good as they need to be? I guess we'll see that as well. But it's hard to look at this, if you're a fan, as anything other than a win. First of all, the ESPN Plus back end has just been a nightmare, although I'm told that, I'm sorry, I should say it's been reported, not that I've been told. It's been reported by Chris Mannix of Sports Illustrated that, TKO Boxing, this has nothing to do with that deal. So, a TKO property could still end up being on ESPN. And in fact, obviously, they just signed a big deal with ESPN on the WWE side. But getting back to the fans on the pay-per-view side, the end of pay-per-view is such an enormous win. There really is no other way around it. You're going to go from spending what you had to pay for ESPN Plus, then the pay-per-view on top of it, and now you only have to spend, I believe, $13 a month in the U.S. in order to get this. That is everything. All the events. $13. That is an insanely good deal. There's no other way around it. A massive W for the fans here in terms of the cost that they're going to have to pay. The loss of having to pay $80 a month, and I realize that piracy has been a big player for many of you probably watching, and certainly the broader market, but to not even have to front anymore and have to worry about that is so enormous as a win. Huge. And really a sign of the times, like how the UFC makes money. Remember, pay-per-view used to be the number one revenue driver maybe 10 years ago, and probably even later than that. But certainly at that point in time of the UFC's run, that was the key way in which they made money. And now a lot of that has changed. A lot of it is contracted revenue. A lot of that is government revenue. A lot of it is overseas contracted revenue, right? It's the paradigm has kind of changed, and this is them adapting. Understand something too, like once you go away from pay-per-view, can you ever really go back? I guess we'll see. Kind of something to pay attention to, though. DAZN, when they first launched in this market, they were like, this is the end of pay-per-view. We're just going to have a monthly subscription fee. And then, it'll be that. The thing is, then they ended up charging for pay-per-view. Could they end up going back on this deal or being like, oh, we're going to add another kind of event that now we have to put behind a paywall? I guess we'll have to see. But what they're saying in the press release is, quote, starting in 2026, Paramount will exclusively distribute UFC's full slate of 13 marquee numbered events. That's the pay-per-view events. And then 30 fight nights via its direct-to-consumer streaming platform, Paramount Plus, with select numbered events, I should say, be simulcast on CBS, Paramount's leading broadcast network. So they're not even saying all 13 of those would air on CBS, but some of them will. Okay, an interesting thing to consider. But for the fans, massive, massive win. Something I don't see a lot of people discussing is actually what this means for ESPN and PFL, as well as another component. The deal talks about having all of the UFC content on Paramount, but it doesn't say exactly whether that includes Road to UFC, which, yes, of course, is UFC content, but it's not a numbered UFC event. Again, Paramount will exclusively distribute UFC's full slate of 13 numbered events and then 30 fight nights. What happens to Road to UFC? What happens to Contender Series? Do those stay on ESPN Plus after this? Where does that go, or does it all eventually end up on back to Fight Pass? Does it go on Paramount Plus? It's really kind of hard to say. It doesn't exactly tell you where all of the entire UFC library of events, Ultimate Fighter, where does that go to such that you still want to watch it? So that part is not necessarily clear. But speaking of ESPN and what this means, now obviously, as we indicated, WWE just signed a deal with ESPN. It's not like they're on the outs with TKO. But what happens to PFL? I can tell you what I've heard. There's a couple different competing theories of what I heard. One, this could be really good for PFL because now they're the only game in town on there, starting in 2026, obviously. And then they have a new CEO coming in. This could be really good for them. They're not very costly for ESPN. They could be an interesting deliverable for them. On the other hand, could ESPN just look around like Paramount did before UFC showed up and just be like, we don't really want to be in the combat sports space if we're not in business with UFC, right? If you just don't even have that, what's the point of having PFL? What's the point of having this sort of broader array of content if you don't have the crown jewel, essentially, of the industry? So it's not really clear. Could this boost PFL's fortunes on ESPN? It could. Could this hurt their fortunes on ESPN? It really could. It really could make a big difference one way or the other. And at this point, it's just simply not clear. But something to keep in mind, where does Ultimate Fighter live? Where does Road to UFC live? Where does Contender Series live? And then also, if it does stay on ESPN or not, what does the ESPN relationship to PFL mean now that UFC is going to be gone? The deal is valued at $7.7 billion for 7 years, so $1.1 billion a year. That is an enormous sum of money. The reports all this time were that it was going to be split between ESPN and Netflix in some capacity. What happened to that deal, we don't know. We'll see if any reporting ever comes out about it. But $1.1 billion is obviously the last ESPN deal was worth $1.5 billion, and that was 7 years. We are talking about almost that per year now. That is a huge sum of money. That is well beyond what the optimistic expectations were. The optimistic expectations were at most $1 billion a year. That was the goal, and that they were probably going to end up, a little bit short of that, somewhere in the $700 to $800 million range. Which, by the way, still would be, way more than they currently get on their annual deal for ESPN as it stands today. So this would still be, even if it was a downgrade from what we got, it would still be well above that. They were going to make bank no matter what. But at $1.1 billion, it's just an enormous sum of money. Now, on the one hand, is it worth that? Paramount Plus, I watch Paramount Plus for Champions League Soccer, for example. That's where I go to watch that. I have a subscription. I've already had one. That's a big thing, but how big is Champions League in the United States? It's growing, but it's not necessarily that big yet. And more to the point, it's very seasonal, right? With with UFC, you have a company that's not in a seasonal format. So now you've got a full slate, a calendar year of events, and they're giving up pay-per-view. So you're getting all of their fight nights and pay-per-views, right? Or again, all of the events that they hold that don't include Contender Series and whatnot. That's a big return for them, right? So you get something that used to be behind a paywall. Now it's essentially behind a different kind of paywall, but a much more manageable one. And you get the full slate of everything. People don't have to look around. Is this one on Paramount? Is this one on ESPN? Everything is right there. You get the whole kit and caboodle. Like, that's got to be worth an enormous sum of money. On the other hand, you got to recall Paramount just did this Skydance merger, and there's a lot of reporting about this, including things that we learned about the firing of Stephen Colbert, and there was the lawsuit that Trump had against CBS, which CBS easily would have won, but they decided to go against it, they decided to drop it, and this deal was made. There was a lot of questions that were asked about to what extent was this deal approved through the FCC, because of course a merger like that has to be approved by the FCC. To what extent was that approved by virtue of what the participants in the merger were doing for the interests of those in the federal government? Now, there's no way for us to know that. I'm merely asking a question. I cannot assert anything to you at this point in time. However, it would be very gullible and ridiculous to at least not even ask the question about to what extent did that play a role when you're well above what the expectations were that we were hearing in the media. Again, somewhere in that $700 to $800 million range per year. And again, UFC kind of even said that their goal was $1 billion a year. They got even above that. It's hard to not notice that potentially, yes, Paramount got a big, very lucrative package here with this UFC rights deal, but they potentially overpaid for it to flatter someone who is connected to Trump world in a very, very top and intimate way. That is speculation. I'm not reporting anything. I don't know that for a fact. But I think, to look at this merger that happened and the unusual circumstances surrounding it in order to make it happen, and then someone who is at the very top of Trump world gets a deal that is arguably more lucrative than it's worth, it's at least worth asking a question. Getting back to ESPN on the boxing side of things, here's another thing to consider. ESPN declined to renew Top Rank at $80 million a year, and Paramount just signed him up for $1.1 billion a year. Now, Top Rank is not equivalent to UFC. It's equivalent to, I don't know, there is no rough equivalent, but it's something like what Strikeforce would have been, or something like that back in its day. They couldn't even get a renewal there. This is why I think boxing is just so done for. Here's the problem with trying to defend boxing in 2025. You can argue against the Boxing Revival Act that they're trying to push through as just a giveaway to TKO, and I think that's the right move. On the other hand, what you cannot defend is the status quo, which is broken, and boxing is in need of repair no matter what. Now, you can choose to prescribe the Boxing Revival Act, which I don't think really repairs it. I think it just fundamentally realters it from the inside out. But the other one would be to boost and enhance the existing Ali Act, obviously as a way to protect the boxers. The point I'm trying to make is the UFC has a deal for complete streaming and partly linear, no more pay-per-view. Meanwhile, boxing may not even have a television deal to be accessing Fox or CBS or ABC, and they're still stuck behind the pay-per-view and at a massively discounted price relative to UFC. They're still having difficulty securing a network television deal. Like, boxing is not just down bad, it is ripe for the picking. The UFC and TKO picked just the right time to lean into what they want, which is, of course, stripping out the federal legislation that allows them to have a UBO, or what I think will eventually be a monopoly in the space. But either way, the timing is absolutely perfect for them, and you can just look at the state of American boxing and realize that you just cannot. How do you defend the status quo of boxing? How do you do that? How do you defend it in that particular way? It just doesn't work anymore. Another interesting question here is fighter pay. Now, of course, I don't know it'll make much of a difference one way or the other if we're talking about, entrant UFC fighters, even middling UFC fighters. The question is at the upper end, where they used to get pay-per-view points. Now, of course, pay-per-views have declined to such a degree that many of those clauses in their contracts, because it's tiered, right? You get a certain amount returned to you from 0 to 200K buys, and then another amount from 2 to 3 or 3 to 5, right? There's a tiered system, and the more you sell, the more money you get returned to you. A lot of those clauses haven't even been exercised because buys have been so low. So in one sense, you might be like, well, what happens to fighter pay here? Maybe nothing, because they weren't getting those kinds of numbers to begin with to exercise those clauses. But they could end up just changing everything here. They could end up rejiggering the whole thing through this move, right? They have to get rid of pay-per-view points. Now, what does it look like at the premium high end for your champions, for your Ilia Toporias, for your, you name it? What do they get? How does their pay work now that there isn't even those contract provisions to exercise? Is it going to be the same amount in some kind of different way? Is it going to be a decline? Is it going to go up? Obviously, I seriously doubt that it would go up, but something to at least consider, right? We can't preclude the possibility. That's something to keep in mind there. We'll have to wait and see, but it's obviously going to be a really important thing. Again, not for the majority of the roster, but for the upper end. I do wonder what this means. And also you might be saying, oh, they're making $7.7 billion. This is where I'm going to come back to it. And congratulations to all the fighters who decided to not do a union where you could have, at least in theory, negotiated for a upfront cut of any kind of television deal, maybe not 50%, but let's just say, 25, 30, 35%, you could have negotiated. Now they get none of that. They got $7.7 billion over the next 7 years. And the fighters, in terms of the television component up front, like an NBA player would get through their union or an NFL player would get through their union, they get $0. I have seen fighters be like, what does this mean for us? Nothing. It means fucking nothing for you. Y'all have continuously decided, for the most part, not everyone, there's been some that have stuck their necks out there, but the vast majority have decided that being quiet and doing nothing was better than trying to advocate for your rights. Well, this is the result of that effort. You get nothing. You get nothing in the end. You get not a penny of this deal up front. You get no piece of the television deal other than what you would ordinarily get through the fighter pay mechanisms that already exist anyway. You get nothing. You get nothing. And that was the future you chose. Not all of them. Not all of them. There were some that obviously got to the UFC now that didn't have a chance to vote on Project Spearhead. Fine. Or any other unionization effort. They tried. There was lots of people that came through MMA and tried to get folks to unionize, and they rejected it at basically every single turn. So congratulations on getting a total of $0 and 0 cents out of $7.7 billion because unionization seemed too abstract and difficult. Amazing. Last but not least, I would add something for myself here, which is, of course, I used to work at Paramount, and they got out of the combat sports business. And, of course, my time with them ended. I had a 3-year deal. They extended me 1 extra year on that deal, so I ended up doing 4 years with them. And then they sold off Showtime Boxing. They sold off, got rid of Bellator, and they were basically done. This is why part of the reason why I think, there's a potential Trump world explanation for how this deal got together. Not totally, but I think some part of it may be playing a role there because they got out of the combat sports business and now they're all the way back in. But of course, the counter to that is, well, yeah, if you can get into the UFC business, that changes the equation. But the point I want to make here is, folks have been asking me on Twitter, like, oh, does this make you upset about how it all ended with MK? No, not at all. There's just no way they would retain me, even if I was still there, right? I've been so critical of the UFC and their business practices that this would easily spell the end of my time there. And again, I don't want to be like disparaging of CBS in any way. They treated me great. I think this would be the case no matter where you went. If they were at CBS and they went to ESPN, it would be the same there. If they were at ESPN and they went to Fox, it'd be the same. It'd be the same no matter where they go, because that's the story that it's been wherever they've gone. There's not been that firewall between them, certainly more recently anyway. There's not been any firewall between the editorial coverage and the kind of coverage they get, and then who the UFC is ultimately in favor of them, who staffs those roles. Like, you just have to play a certain game if you want to have those jobs. It's just a reality, and I've just never been a guy to play those games. So my time would have ended there no matter what. The key to what I do is having independence, right? And if I don't have editorial independence, then I don't have much. And they wouldn't keep me anyway, and even if they did, my coverage would change so substantially that it would be unrecognizable. It wouldn't work. It wouldn't work. So I'm grateful for the time that I had there. I'm going to say it one more time. They treated me great. Anybody who works there will get treated amazingly well. It's a phenomenal company, but I just think in terms of the, just knowing what UFC demands on the editorial side, it never would have worked for me there. So I would have been gone by hook or by crook, sooner or later. My time there would have come to a close, and I'm totally okay with that. Like I again, what I value is the ability to get up here and say what I think, not say what I think in a way that's pleasing to the people that I am talking about. Oh, one final piece, if I may. The UFC at the White House, definitely going to be on Paramount Plus, I'm guessing, right? Or maybe, no, that'll be on CBS. That'll be on CBS. Definitely that'll be on, it has to be, right? They're not going to put that on Paramount. I mean, it might simulcast on Paramount Plus, but they're going to put that on CBS. So UFC the White House on CBS, crazy times, crazy times. I'll have more to say about this as we learn more information, as we get more information about the deal and what it means and what it doesn't and what's coming and what's going. Still a lot of unanswered questions, but a monumental day in the history of mixed martial arts and a monumental day in the history of the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Stay tuned.